Welcome the Lord's chosen. People don't fear noise. They fear change they didn't authorize. There's a strange moment that happens when you stop talking the way you used to. Not the dramatic kind of silence that announces itself, but the quiet that arrives without explanation. The kind that doesn't beg to be noticed. That's when people start paying attention. Not because you said something impressive, but because something familiar disappeared. Here's a fact most people don't like admitting. Human beings rely on predictability more than honesty. We feel safe when we can guess someone's reactions, their timing, their emotional range. Studies in behavioral psychology show that when a predictable pattern suddenly stops, the brain flags it as a potential threat long before it labels it as curiosity. Translation: when you changed your rhythm, you didn't confuse people, you unsettled them. At first, they didn't take you seriously. They assumed you were tired, emotional, distracted, maybe going through a phase, because that's easier than accepting that you've shifted your position without filing a notice. Silence, after all, is often misread as weakness until it refuses to behave like one. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. When you went quiet, some people didn't miss you. They missed access. They missed the version of you that responded on cue, explained intentions, smoothed tension, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and made things easier than they needed to be. Your quiet didn't remove your presence. It removed their leverage. There's also a bit of accidental comedy in this. The same people who once told you to speak up now seem deeply concerned about what you're thinking. Funny how that works. Silence becomes suspicious only when it's no longer controllable. This isn't about mystique or playing mind games. It's about what happens when you stop performing familiarity and start standing still in your own space. Because when you don't announce growth, don't explain distance, and don't rush to clarify, people are forced to confront a reality they didn't prepare for. You didn't get louder. You got harder to manage. And that's when they realized this wasn't a phase. It was a shift. Number one, you stopped explaining yourself. There was a time when you felt the need to give context for everything you did. If you were quiet, you explained why. If you changed direction, you justified it. If you said no, you softened it with reasons so people wouldn't take it the wrong way. You weren't weak for doing that. You were just trying to be understood. But over time, something shifted. You realized that explanations weren't bringing clarity. They were giving people permission to debate your life. When you stopped explaining yourself, it wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion. You noticed that no matter how clearly you spoke, some people still heard what benefited them. Your words became evidence they could twist, analyze, or use to poke holes in your choices. So you pulled your explanations back, quietly, without an announcement. That's when things changed. People started feeling uneasy because they no longer had access to your reasoning. Before they could predict you, they knew if they questioned you long enough, you'd eventually open up and make them comfortable. Now, they're left with outcomes instead of stories, decisions instead of justifications, and that's a harder position to argue with. Here's the truth most don't admit. Explanations invite negotiation. Once you explain, you're no longer just stating a choice. You're offering it up for approval. By stopping, you closed that door. You didn't become rude. You became final. Some people took it personally. They assumed your silence meant arrogance, secrecy, or distance. But what really bothered them was the loss of influence. They could no longer steer your decisions by questioning your motives or pretending concern. Your life stopped being a group discussion. And strangely, that's when respect crept in. Not the loud kind with compliments, but the quiet kind that shows up as caution. People thought twice before crossing lines. They chose their words more carefully. Because when someone doesn't explain themselves, it signals confidence. It says, I know why I'm here, even if you don't. You didn't owe anyone an explanation. You were just reminding them of that. Number 2, you no longer react on schedule. There was a time when your responses were predictable. Messages got replies quickly. Disrespect got immediate correction. Praise got instant appreciation. People knew your timing, and without realizing it, they began to rely on it. Your reactions became part of their routine. That's how access quietly turns into entitlement. Then you stopped reacting on schedule, not out of spite, not to play games. You simply stopped letting urgency bully you. You took time before responding, not because you were calculating, but because you were no longer available on demand. And that small shift caused a bigger disturbance than you expected. When someone is used to instant reactions, silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like resistance. Your pause interrupted their sense of importance. It forced them to sit with their words, their tone, their behavior, without immediate feedback to guide or soothe them. That waiting period made people replay what they said, second-guess how it landed, and wonder if they overstepped. That's power most people don't realize they gave away until it's gone. You also stopped rewarding bad timing. You no longer responded while angry just to clear the air. You didn't rush to fix misunderstandings the moment they appeared. You let moments breathe, and in doing so, you protected yourself from saying things you'd have to walk back later. Some people read this as distance, others read it as confidence. The difference depended on how much control they thought they had before. Those who benefited from your quick reactions felt unsettled. Those who respected you adjusted. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Reacting fast keeps relationships moving, but it also keeps them shallow. Slowing down forces depth. It reveals intention. It shows who expects access and who earns it. Your delayed response didn't mean you cared less. It meant you cared enough to choose when and how you engaged. You stopped letting other people set the emotional pace of your life. And once people realized your time and attention were no longer automatic, they started treating both with more care. Because nothing changes behavior faster than uncertainty paired with self-control. Number 3, you removed emotional access without announcement. You didn't storm out. You didn't make dramatic declarations. You didn't post cryptic messages online to make them notice. You simply stopped offering the easy access to your feelings that they had taken for granted. You removed the emotional shortcut they relied on, and the absence hit harder than anything you could have said. For a long time, people were accustomed to dipping into your emotional world whenever they wanted. They knew how to push buttons, what tone would get you to open up, and which vulnerabilities were theirs for the taking. Your openness became a tool, not a gift. And when you quietly reclaimed it, they didn't just notice, they panicked. Humans are wired to fear what they can't read, and suddenly your inner world was no longer theirs to decipher. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries they refused to acknowledge. Every time you used to explain, justify, or comfort, you were giving them a map to your inner workings. When you withdrew, the map disappeared. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was clarity. They had to face you without shortcuts, without cues, and without the safety net of access. And the reactions were telling. Some tried to push harder, poke through the quiet, or manipulate your return. Others suddenly treated their words and actions with caution, realizing they no longer had the automatic emotional cushioning. That shift is subtle but seismic. The power balance changes when people can't rely on the easy version of you. Your quiet wasn't cold. It was intentional. You didn't remove yourself entirely. You just made it clear that your emotional energy was no longer a resource for someone else's convenience. They had to earn it. And that's when they realized you weren't just quiet. You were untouchable in ways that mattered. By removing emotional access without announcement, You forced them to confront something they had ignored for too long. They had underestimated you, relied on you too much, and assumed you would always be available. Now they knew better. Number 4, you let people live with their own behavior. You stopped smoothing things over. You stopped excusing rudeness, brushing off disrespect, and explaining away the way people treated you. You stopped intervening in situations where others had already shown their true colors. For the first time, you allowed people to sit in the consequences of their own actions, and it was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Before, you often carried the weight of their mistakes. You clarified misunderstandings, took the blame they tried to pass on, and made excuses for behavior that didn't deserve one. That made interactions easier in the short term, but it also taught people they could take liberties with your time, your energy, and your respect. By finally stepping back, you disrupted that pattern. You stopped being the safety net for their chaos. The effect was immediate. Suddenly, people had to face themselves. They had to sit with the awkwardness, the disrespect, and the tension they had previously been able to offload onto you. Without your constant corrections, explanations, or reassurances, they were forced to examine how they behaved when no one was holding their hand. And that realization isn't gentle. It hits like a shock wave. Some reacted with confusion, some with frustration, and others with guilt. They realized that you were no longer their buffer, their mediator, or their emotional crutch. You were present, but present on your terms. And that's what unsettled them the most. They could no longer manipulate the outcome by controlling your response. Letting people live with their own behavior isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It exposes patterns, highlights accountability, and separates those who respect boundaries from those who don't. By refusing to intervene, you made it impossible for them to ignore the impact of their actions. For the first time, they understood that your silence, your distance, and your calm weren't passive. They were deliberate. You weren't allowing disrespect to continue. You were letting reality do the teaching, and reality is far harsher than any words you could have offered. They realized that underestimating you had consequences, and that realization alone made you untouchable in ways they had never anticipated. Number 5, you broke the pattern they memorized. People love patterns because they make life predictable. They like knowing how you will react, when you will respond, and what kind of energy you bring to every interaction. Patterns are comforting, even when they quietly give others control over you. They assumed they knew you, could anticipate you, and that your behavior would always fit into a mold they understood. Then you broke it. It wasn't dramatic. You didn't announce a transformation or post a manifesto. You simply stopped being the version of yourself that fit neatly into their expectations. Small shifts, longer pauses before responding, refusing to justify your choices, letting outcomes unfold without immediate commentary, disrupted the rhythm they had memorized. And once the rhythm broke, the illusion of control shattered. What happens next is fascinating. People don't immediately recognize the change as strength. At first, they may think you're distracted, tired, or emotionally distant. But gradually, that uncertainty gnaws at them. They begin to question everything they assumed about you. They realize their mental shortcuts no longer work. Every interaction requires recalibration, and they are forced to pay attention in ways they never had to before. Breaking the pattern doesn't just unsettle people, it shifts power. When someone relies on predictability to manipulate, influence, or even just navigate a relationship, removing that predictability removes their advantage. Suddenly, they have to approach you on your terms, not the terms they've grown comfortable with. That makes them cautious, deliberate, and sometimes even fearful. And here's the beauty of it. Breaking the pattern doesn't require aggression or confrontation. It requires consistency, patience, and refusal to conform. The quiet, subtle refusal to be readable is far more effective than any argument or spectacle. By refusing to fit the mold they had memorized, you didn't just disrupt expectations, you rewrote the rules. People realized they were dealing with someone who couldn't be anticipated, manipulated, or underestimated. That realization isn't just surprising, it's transformative. And that's when they start seeing you differently, finally understanding that your quiet isn't absence, it's power in motion. Number 6, you no longer perform understanding. For a long time, you carried the weight of other people's emotions. You nodded when it wasn't deserved, smiled when it was exhausting, and absorbed complaints, criticisms, and chaos that didn't belong to you. You performed understanding because it made life smoother, kept the peace, and made others feel safe around you. But every act of performance came at a cost. Your energy, your clarity, your authority over your own space. Then you stopped performing. You didn't make a show of withdrawal or announce a new philosophy. You simply stopped pretending that every grievance needed your validation, that every misunderstanding required a lecture, and that every discomfort demanded your labor to soothe. You stopped bending yourself into a version others could easily digest. That shift, subtle as it may have seemed, was seismic to those who had grown accustomed to taking your emotional labor for granted. People immediately noticed it. It's unnerving to realize that the person who once explained, justified, and absorbed is now watching without comment, listening without intervention, and choosing when to engage instead of automatically soothing. Suddenly, they're confronted with the raw consequences of their own words and actions, without the safety net of your patience or explanation. The illusion that they could rely on your understanding, that they could manipulate your empathy to smooth over their own behavior, crumbles. And here's the real impact. Once you stop performing understanding, you reclaim a level of authority over your presence that people often don't anticipate. You're no longer a tool for their comfort. You're a participant in your own life, not a character in theirs. That forces them to reflect, adjust, and respect boundaries they previously ignored. Your silence isn't cold, it's selective. Your attention isn't absent, it's intentional. By refusing to perform understanding, you aren't withdrawing from the world. You're reminding it that your empathy is valuable, not automatic. And when they finally realize that their attempts to predict or manipulate your reactions no longer work, that's when the quiet transforms into unmistakable power. Number 7, you let awkwardness sit in the room. For years, you smoothed over every uncomfortable moment. A pause in conversation, you filled it. A tense silence, you explained it away. Someone said something careless, you laughed it off. You took on the responsibility of keeping interactions easy, predictable, and safe, even when it cost you energy and authenticity. People relied on you to perform comfort, to bridge gaps, and to make life feel lighter. Then you stopped. You let awkwardness exist. You stopped rushing to rescue conversations, stopped apologizing for things that weren't your fault, and stopped cushioning the consequences of other people's behavior. Silence stretched longer. Pauses became noticeable, and the tension that used to be invisible was suddenly unavoidable. You didn't make a scene, but by refusing to erase discomfort, you made people notice something they'd been ignoring, themselves. The impact was immediate and telling. Some people fidgeted. Others tried to talk over the discomfort, to reclaim the rhythm they were used to. A few even attempted to explain themselves unnecessarily, as if their words alone could smooth the space you were deliberately leaving intact. And there you were, steady, calm, unmoved, letting reality, your reality, exist without interference. This is where power quietly asserts itself. By allowing awkwardness, you forced others to confront moments they previously relied on you to fix. They realized they could no longer manipulate the flow or tone of interactions by expecting your intervention. They had to navigate the tension themselves, and that uncertainty made them cautious, attentive, and even a little intimidated. There's no aggression here, no need for dramatics. Simply refusing to perform comfort or erase friction is enough to reset how people perceive you. You become someone who is present on their terms, not on others' expectations. And when they finally recognize that you aren't smoothing over life for their convenience anymore, they start treating your space, your time, and your attention differently. Letting awkwardness sit is quiet, unspoken, and highly effective. It reveals character, tests patience, and, most importantly, signals that you are no longer available to be managed. That is the kind of power that leaves people unsettled, aware, and ultimately respectful. Number 8, you made your absence more structured than your presence. Before, your presence was predictable. People knew when they could reach you, when you would respond, and what kind of energy you would bring. Your availability, your attention, your reactions. They were all part of a rhythm that others had memorized. They relied on it, often without realizing it, and that reliance quietly gave them influence over your time, your energy, and even your decisions. Then you changed the game. You didn't vanish completely. You didn't abandon responsibilities or cut ties. Instead, you structured your absence with purpose. You decided when and how you would show up. Your attention was no longer automatic. It became deliberate. And that shift, subtle though it may have seemed, disrupted the entire dynamic. People started noticing because they could no longer take your availability for granted. Suddenly, reaching you required timing, patience, and respect. That gap, carefully maintained, made them feel the weight of your presence in a way that your constant availability never had. Absence, when structured, isn't emptiness, it's influence. It forces people to pause, reflect, and recognize your value. When your presence is predictable, it becomes background noise. But when your absence is intentional, it creates tension, anticipation, and respect. People begin to measure their words, their actions, and even their expectations, because they realize you are no longer a resource to be consumed at will. The brilliance of this strategy is in its quietness. You don't announce it. You don't make it a spectacle. You simply calibrate your involvement, letting your absence speak louder than any words ever could. And the result is immediate. Those who once assumed control over your attention now find themselves adjusting, recalculating, and respecting boundaries they previously ignored. By making your absence more structured than your presence, you flipped the script entirely. You showed that your attention is valuable, that your time is yours, and that your energy is not a commodity. And that realization is far more powerful than any confrontation, any speech, or any explanation could ever be. People finally understood. They weren't just missing you. They were reckoning with the fact that you were no longer to be managed. Number 9, you stopped correcting their version of you. For a long time, you felt compelled to make sure people got you. If they misunderstood your intentions, you explained. If they twisted your words, you clarified. If they assumed things about your motives, you corrected them. You spent energy shaping their perception, smoothing the edges of their assumptions, and polishing the version of yourself they held in their minds. It was exhausting, but you did it because you wanted to be understood, or at least because you thought it mattered. Then you stopped. You stopped policing their thoughts, stopping their misinterpretations, or chasing after approval. You stopped bending yourself to fix their flawed perception. You didn't make a show of it. You didn't argue. You simply let their version of you exist, unchallenged. And the effect was immediate and striking. People who had taken your explanations for granted began noticing the difference. They realized they no longer had a say in defining you. This change is subtle but devastatingly powerful. When you stop correcting, people are forced to wrestle with the reality of you on their own. Misunderstandings can linger, assumptions can fester, and suddenly they're facing a version of you that isn't negotiable. You become something they can't fully control, a presence that doesn't conform to the narrative they prefer. Some people panic. They try harder to convince themselves of their version of you, to reconcile the gap between perception and reality. Others step back, cautious, because they realize the rules have changed. You no longer exist to be interpreted. You exist to be present. By refusing to correct their version of you, you reclaim ownership of your identity. You signal that you are not here to perform, justify, or negotiate your existence. Your energy is no longer available to mend the errors in their thinking, and that quiet refusal has a weight far greater than any confrontation ever could. When they finally recognize it, the realization hits harder than words. You are no longer their version of you. You are simply you, and that alone changes everything. Number 10, you didn't chase closure. For years, you felt the need to tie up every loose end, to explain every misstep, to give people the comfort of resolution, even when it wasn't yours to provide. You chased closure not because you needed it, but because others expected it. Arguments were ended, misunderstandings were smoothed, and endings were packaged neatly so that everyone else could move on without discomfort. You carried the weight of finality for people who weren't willing to do the work themselves. Then you stopped. You didn't force a conversation to make things clear. You didn't explain yourself, justify actions, or plead for understanding. You let things sit. You allowed moments to breathe, outcomes to unfold, and people to sit with the consequences of their choices. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. Humans aren't used to loose ends. They crave closure like a safety net. When it doesn't arrive, they panic, overthink, and sometimes even confront the truth about themselves in ways they would have avoided if you had rushed to fix it. By refusing to chase closure, you force people to reckon with uncertainty. They couldn't rely on you to soften the blow of their mistakes or to make endings convenient. They had to face your decisions, your boundaries, and your silence without expecting commentary or apology. That's a position most aren't prepared for. This isn't about being cold or indifferent. It's about refusing to grant people a comfort they don't deserve. It's about letting the natural consequences of behavior play out without interference. And in doing so, you create a kind of power that is quiet but undeniable. People start to realize that you operate on your own terms, not theirs. When you don't chase closure, you reveal something most people don't expect, that life isn't about satisfying everyone else's need for reassurance. Your silence becomes a statement. Your inaction becomes a lesson. And in that space, people finally recognize that you're no longer to be managed, negotiated with, or underestimated. They realize that some endings are yours to decide, and that realization changes how they see, treat, and approach you forever. Number 11, you became harder to read, not harder to reach. For a long time, people had you figured out. They could anticipate your moods, your reactions, your energy, and even the way you would respond under pressure. Your expressions, your words, your tone. They were an open book for anyone who cared to read it. That predictability made life easier for them. It allowed them to navigate interactions without real effort, to assume influence over your emotional state, and to measure your limits as if they were fixed and transparent. Then you changed. You didn't disappear. You didn't shut people out entirely. You simply became less readable. You didn't broadcast your emotions on demand. You didn't over-explain your actions, and you didn't let others shape your energy to fit their expectations. People could still reach you, still communicate with you, still interact, but the version they had memorized no longer applied. Your silence wasn't absence. It was intentional opacity, a refusal to be fully interpreted. The effect is subtle but powerful. When someone can't read you, they can't anticipate your reactions. They can't manipulate your responses. They can't rely on the familiar shortcuts that once gave them control. And because humans are wired to fear unpredictability, even minor uncertainty can feel threatening. Every word you speak, every action you take, now carries weight because it is no longer part of a script they wrote for you. This isn't about being mysterious for attention or games. It's about reclaiming authority over your presence. By being harder to read, you force people to engage with you on your terms, to respect boundaries, and to measure their words and actions carefully. It's a quiet assertion of power that doesn't require confrontation, drama, or noise. When they realize they no longer have automatic access to your inner world, the shift is undeniable. Respect replaces assumption. Caution replaces entitlement. And slowly, deliberately, they come to understand that you are no longer the predictable person they thought they knew. You are fully yourself, untouchable by their expectations, and unshakable in your autonomy. Number 12, you let time do the talking instead of urgency. For years, you felt pressured to respond immediately, to fix things in the moment, and to prove yourself through quick reactions. Urgency became a habit, and people began to rely on it. They assumed that your attention, energy, and presence were instant resources, always available to smooth over problems, answer questions, or validate their perspectives. That expectation gave them quiet control. They knew you would act, and they could plan around it. Then you stopped. You let time do the talking. You didn't rush to prove points, clarify misunderstandings, or assert your position immediately. You allowed situations to unfold, conversations to linger, and outcomes to emerge naturally. It wasn't laziness or indecision. It was deliberate patience. And in that patience, power quietly shifted. People realized that your validation wasn't automatic, your reactions weren't guaranteed, and your approval wasn't something they could demand. The impact is subtle but profound. When you don't respond in urgency, it forces others to live with their words, actions, and choices without instant mitigation. They have to process reality on their own, without the comforting buffer of your immediate intervention. That pause creates reflection, tension, and sometimes even fear. People start to reconsider how they interact, how they speak, and how they behave, because they can no longer rely on quick fixes to smooth over their mistakes or assumptions. By letting time speak, you also protect yourself. You stop reacting from impulse or emotion, allowing clarity, strategy, and boundaries to guide your actions. You no longer expend energy on unnecessary battles or explanations. Instead, outcomes reveal the truth of character, intentions, and respect. This quiet approach carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. People begin to notice, not because of what you say, but because of what you choose not to say. They realize that your attention, your energy, and your presence are not disposable, and that nothing in their timing can force you to act. When they finally see it, they understand that patience is your weapon, calm is your statement, and letting time do the talking is how you make it unmistakably clear. You are not to be underestimated. Number 13, you moved without announcing growth. For a long time, people measured you by what you showed them. They assumed they understood your trajectory because you shared milestones, victories, or even the smallest steps of progress. They felt entitled to witness your growth, to comment on it, to validate it, or even to judge it. Your evolution became a performance for their comfort, a spectacle for their perception, and knowingly or not, they used it to gauge their own influence over you. Then you changed. You moved forward without announcing it. You didn't post updates, explain your progress, or signal your achievements. You didn't feel the need to showcase that you were advancing, learning, or becoming stronger. You simply acted, and the results spoke quietly but unmistakably. This silent growth caught people off guard. They realized that while they were busy analyzing, doubting, or assuming, life was happening around them, and you were not waiting for their recognition to move forward. This is the subtle power of unannounced growth. It removes their ability to manipulate perception. When you no longer inform others about your progress, you stop playing into their expectations, their judgments, and their need to compare. Your evolution becomes uncontestable, inevitable, and undeniable. People can't debate it because it doesn't need explanation. It exists, it happens, and it forces them to catch up or accept that they are witnessing change they can't influence. Moving silently also shifts how they perceive your energy. You are no longer performing for approval or understanding. You are operating from authenticity and self-determination. That realization is disorienting for those who assumed they had insight into your life. It subtly rewires their expectations, making them cautious, reflective, and ultimately respectful. By refusing to announce growth, you demonstrate that real change doesn't seek validation. It doesn't need applause. It simply reshapes your life, your path, and your boundaries. And when people notice the transformation, they realize too late that you were never performing for them. You were building, evolving, and becoming someone they underestimated. That is the quiet shock of true power. Number 14. You didn't return the same person. People are often comfortable with repetition. They expect consistency in ways that benefit them, predictable moods, familiar reactions, and behaviors they've learned to navigate. They assume that even if you change, the core version of you will remain recognizable, malleable, and manageable. They think that the quiet, the distance, or the subtle shifts are temporary, and that eventually you will return to the version they know, the version they can influence, the version they can predict. Then you didn't. You came back, but you weren't the same person they had memorized. Your tone was clearer, your boundaries sharper, and your presence more intentional. The patience, silence, and distance you cultivated weren't empty. They were recalibration. You had grown, evolved, and changed in ways that were visible not through words or announcements, but through the weight and clarity of your energy. People immediately noticed. Not everyone welcomed it. Some were unsettled, some intimidated, and some quietly panicked because they realized that their assumptions, expectations, and influence no longer applied. This is where quiet power becomes undeniable. Change doesn't have to be loud to be shocking. By simply returning as a refined, more decisive version of yourself, you made it clear that your life is yours to shape, and that you are no longer accountable to the perception, approval, or control of others. They can no longer predict your reactions, manipulate your choices, or lean on the version of you they once knew. The brilliance lies in subtlety. You didn't need to announce transformation, demand respect, or prove strength. Your presence, slightly altered, was enough to shift the dynamic completely. They had to face the reality that the person they thought they knew no longer existed, and that the person before them now moved with intention, clarity, and autonomy. Returning as someone new isn't just growth, it's a declaration. It says without words that you've evolved beyond expectation, that you no longer perform for others, and that you are no longer to be underestimated. And that realization, more than anything else, commands respect. When you've been quiet for a while, it's easy for others to assume you've softened, retreated, or even weakened. But the truth is far more powerful. Every pause, every delay, every refusal to explain, perform, or rush. These are not signs of absence. They are signals of transformation. You've stopped giving people the scripts they relied on, the shortcuts they took for granted, and the control they quietly assumed over your energy and attention. By letting silence speak, letting time unfold, and moving without announcement, you've shifted the dynamic in ways that are impossible to ignore. The people around you have started to notice. They sense the boundaries you've enforced, the patience you've claimed, and the growth you've quietly achieved. They realize that the person they once understood no longer exists in the same way, and that quiet, deliberate change is what makes you impossible to underestimate. Power doesn't always roar. It often whispers, waits, and transforms quietly, leaving the world to catch up. Remember, every act of restraint, every moment of thoughtful distance, and every instance of refusing to perform for others is not a loss. It's mastery. You've become someone who operates on your own terms, someone whose presence demands respect without explanation, and someone whose evolution cannot be contained or predicted. That is the essence of being unshakable. If this resonated with you and you want more insights that challenge how you think, empower your presence, and sharpen your edge, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Every action you take here helps us create content that pushes the boundaries and gives you the clarity to navigate life on your own terms. Don't just watch, engage, grow, and join the conversation. Merry Christmas, and stay blessed always.